What's up, folks? Mark Moody here with Monongahela Media, and welcome to the new YouTube channel. This is going to be the first video and the only video that I put out in 2023. So I'm not going to make this a video about 2023. This is in fact about my favorite camera and, in my opinion, the best camera I bought in 2023. I said there was a lot of crazy stuff that happened this year. I bought a house, which I'm actually recording the video in the sort of half-finished basement of the house right now. I broke my foot. It was my first broken bone for the first time. What else? I started to grow my other side business, Monongahela Media, fairly decent this year, which I'm pretty proud of. And I did a lot of work with cameras, which was, of course, a lot of fun. And with that came me buying quite a bit of camera gear. I actually bought my first cinema camera. I bought some other mirrorless cameras, but I also bought some older cameras. And if anything, out of all the gear that I bought this year, I would say the Canon 5D Classic is my favorite and the best camera that I bought this year. Here's why. So a little bit about the camera, which is the 5D Classic. It was a Canon camera released all the way back in 2005. It had a 12 megapixel sensor, 9 autofocus points, really not much else besides that. I mean, it could shoot in continuous mode up to 3 frames per second, which is like nothing compared to modern cameras. I mean, if you stack this thing up against the Canon R5 or the R6 Mark II, it's nothing. It's a pretty bare bones camera to today's standards. It's old, it's outdated, but I'd say after the last 8 months of me using this camera, it's a lot of fun. I actually had my eye on this camera all the way back in 2018, just watching some YouTube video thinking, oh, this is a cool camera. I really would like to buy this, but I didn't have any justification for buying it. And so fast forward 5 years later, in 2023, I still had no justification for buying it. I actually wasn't doing anything at the time. It was right after I broke my foot, so I was pretty much on rest for like a month. Couldn't do many photo gigs, and I just fell down a couple of YouTube rabbit holes, metaphorically, and then I just ended up committing to buying this camera. I said, what the hell? I'll just spend $250, buy a camera, see where it goes. What's the harm? And I also wanted something new. I noticed that my workflow, and I noticed that the content that I was putting out seemed to be getting a little bit stale. It was just, I don't know, I felt like photography kind of just wasn't that fun for me anymore. So I wanted to try something new, and I didn't want to blow $4,000 on another R5 or on a cinema camera. I mean, that would come later. But at that time, I didn't want to throw a bunch of money at something only for it to give me the same results that all my other stuff was giving me. And what was interesting is this was my first time going out of my way to buy a DSLR, because majority of the cameras that I use are mirrorless cameras, and I hadn't really purchased a DSLR since I used my Canon 80D way back in 2017. And there was also this term going around on social media or on YouTube about vintage digital cameras that use these older CCD sensors to capture the images. And I guess they just had cooler colors, or I mean, they rendered colors a little bit differently. They had a quote-unquote filmic look to them, or the photos looked like film out of the camera. So I was curious, and I already had a bunch of Canon lenses, so why not? So one day I just went ahead and purchased an old 5D off of eBay, and I was pretty excited when I got this camera. So first impressions with using this camera right out of the box, it's big. It's massive compared to the size of some of the other cameras that I use, like my Canon R or the R7s. It's pretty big. It's clunky. But in the hand, it feels really comfortable. Now, from when I worked at the aquarium, I had some experience using cameras like the 5D Mark III and the 5D Mark II. So with this being the Mark I, the button layout isn't totally unfamiliar. It's pretty easy to get the hang of. It's a pretty familiar and pretty easy setup. You have, the buttons on the back for your menu, to play back the photos that you've taken. You got this dial here on the back for adjusting your aperture. That's what I like to use it for. Up here on the top right side of the camera, you've got your shutter button, your shutter dial, a few other buttons here to adjust your drive, your white balance, your ISO. The other cool thing is that this camera, even though it's like 18 years old, it has an LCD screen, which is pretty nice. It's helpful, but I wouldn't totally trust this, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. I think the only thing that was tricky to find for like the first 2 seconds of holding this camera was how to turn it on, but the on-off button is right there on the back, just below the LCD screen. Nothing crazy, it's not a deal breaker. Outside of that, once you turn on the camera and go through some of the settings, go through the menu, like the rest of the camera, it's bare bones. So there's not not much going on here, but if you're familiar with Canon's menu system, it shouldn't be too difficult to navigate. Less fancy features, there's less distractions, so it's pretty good. And then, once the camera's all set up, ready, good to go, using it is a lot of fun. For starters, it's refreshing. It's a clunky camera. It's a little awkward sometimes, but that's not bad. It's a different camera compared to what I'm used to using. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm all mirrorless. So with this being an old DSLR, it's different for me. And so the shooting style was just ever so slightly different, that it made photography with this camera fun. And one of the best things about it is that because this is an older Canon camera, it's an EF mount, which pairs perfectly with a lot of my EF lenses. Back before I went totally mirrorless, I invested quite a bit in EF lenses. So it's perfect that this camera pairs really well with them. And out of all the EF lenses, I prefer using prime lenses over zooms with this camera. I really don't think it needs zoom lenses, although I have used the 70-200 with it occasionally. But outside of that, I typically love to use prime lenses. Like on here right now, I have a 50 f1.4 prime lens. Before I was using a 50 f1.8, the nifty 50, and I gotta tell you, that's a solid lens to use with this camera. It's cheap, affordable, and takes phenomenal photos. Plus, once you have a lens on here and when you're all ready to roll, the shutter sound is just incredible. Just listen to this. It's cool, right? It's like so crisp, so wicked. I think like crisp is the perfect word to describe how the shutter sounds in this camera. So the 5D Classic isn't a total dinosaur of a camera. Yes, it's bare bones, but it does have autofocus. It has 9 autofocus points. It's not like the 9 quadrillion that mirrorless cameras have nowadays. It's just 9. And 1 out of all the 9 of them is good. I don't like to use the outside autofocus points just because they kind of suck from time to time, so I strictly just stick with using the center autofocus point. And even then, the autofocus isn't amazing all the time, but if you're like photographing a couple quick portraits or maybe an event or maybe a landscape with it, it works pretty well and it's good. So with this camera having a lot of limiting features, it does slow your photography down a little bit. And with that, I had to more so rely on my skills as a photographer to get those photos rather than relying on the camera to help me get those photos, if that makes sense. What I mean by that is with a lot of mirrorless cameras, the electronic viewfinder, the EVF, in my opinion, kind of cheats a little bit with helping you get your exposure right. It kind of just shows you what your exposure is going to look like beforehand, or shows you what your depth of field will look like beforehand. Whereas with the 5D Classic, it's solely relying on the mirror inside of the camera to show you what your image will look like, more so just for composition purposes. But then for your exposure, it's got that classic little green light meter at the bottom that'll let you know if your picture is going to be over or underexposed. So that I'm kind of used to, but once again, with using mirrorless cameras, we're kind of given that. Whereas with this camera, kind of have to work for it a little bit. And that leads me to my next point about the LCD on this camera. It sucks. It is pretty bad. It looks old, it feels old, and I wouldn't trust it if I were you. If anything, with this camera, what I've learned are a couple things. When you take a photo, it might look underexposed when in reality on Lightroom, it's like perfectly exposed. It's awesome, looks great. But if you take a photo and on the LCD, it looks good, it might actually be underexposed or overexposed. And the LCD won't tell you that. And then if your photo is overexposed, your photo might have pretty decent exposure. So the LCD kind of lies to you like that. Like you sort of think, oh, okay, if it's overexposed, maybe I should underexpose it, picture will look good. No, that's not the case. The camera lies to you. It's fibbing the whole time. Don't trust it. So with that in mind, you have to kind of use the histogram in the camera to judge your exposure. So one of the reasons why I bought this camera was a lot of folks in the digital vintage movement were talking about how some of these older CCD cameras take film-like photos straight out of the camera, and that's solely shooting in JPEG in the camera. So with the 5D Classic, this is the only camera where I intentionally shoot in JPEG. And I know that's like kind of weird because a lot of photographers, or more so every photographer I know, is shooting in RAW. Like if you don't shoot RAW, you're not a real photographer. And I say that's bullcrap. That's No. I mean, if you want to shoot in RAW, yes, shoot in RAW. RAW is going to give you a little more data, a little more flexibility. But if you're just taking pictures to just take the pictures, there's nothing wrong with JPEGs. And when it comes to the JPEGs in this camera, they're pretty solid. Honestly, they don't require much to get them to look nice. I mean, I like to edit my JPEGs a little bit, but if you're someone that doesn't want to do a whole lot of editing, the JPEGs in this camera look super nice just straight out of the camera. But when I do decide to edit, you know, I like to adjust a couple things here and there, maybe up the contrast, maybe bring up the highlights some more to give it a little more of an imperfect look, or maybe some of that filmic look. And then I also like to adjust the scale of the photo to kind of give it like a vintage matte looking feel. It's just personal preference there. Now, as for the photos overall, they're 12 megapixels, so it's not like they're like super high resolution. But, you know, if you're a photographer or if you're someone that's just taking photos for social media, or even for platforms where these photos are not going to be viewed on gigantic screens, 12 megapixels is just fine. Now, as for the film-like photos in the camera, yes and no. I would say that because this is an older camera and older technology, it's not as perfect compared to today's standards. So the imperfections of the image make it look like film. But is it going to look like Ilford or Portra 400 film? Probably not. It does render, you know, certain colors a little bit differently. Like the greens straight out of the camera just look different compared to the greens on my modern cameras, which I kind of like. But straight out of the camera, they're not solely like strictly going to look like film. Now, why do I continue to use this camera given the fact that it's old? You know, it may not be a perfect camera. There's a lot of limitations to it. Honestly, it's all a matter of perspective when it comes to this camera. And once I got a little more familiar with using this camera, I made it a habit to take it with me everywhere. I took it to Cheat Fest for the very first time and used it in the field just to snap a couple pictures of the event here and there. I took it with me to Dolly Sods and a few of my trips in the early summer. I used it at a wedding once, which was pretty cool. It was a nice little backup camera. And I even took it with me up to Maine, which was nice. And that was kind of neat. It was just a fun little walk around camera. Kind of turned into like a bit of a glorified point and shoot at one point, but it was just fun and it was just very freeing to use this camera like that. And consistently, wherever I brought this camera and with every image that I took, even if the focus was a little bit off or even if my exposure was a little bit off, it just made photography fun again. And I loved that. There was even one time when my main camera failed on me just before a newborn session, and I ended up using the 5D Classic as the camera for that session, and the pictures came out awesome. The mother was super happy with the photos, which was great. It was awesome. It was reassuring, and it actually instilled a little bit more confidence in this old camera. Things I don't like, honestly, I don't like the fact that there isn't any video in this camera, which I know is kind of ridiculous because, I mean, the camera's a little bit old. It's not really a hybrid camera. The 5D Mark II solved this issue, and they did put video in that camera, but I think it would be so interesting to see what video would look like coming out of this old CCD sensor. Also, I'll go right back to it again. It's a big camera. The footprint's huge, so it does take up quite a bit of space in my camera bag. And then sometimes the autofocus just sucks. And as a cherry on top, the viewfinder will lie to you. So if you think a photo is going to be in focus, it actually might not be in focus. So it's a little bit of a gamble when you use this camera from time to time. Now, would I recommend the 5D Classic? Yes, I absolutely would. Reason being is because it's different, and if there's anything that I've learned this year in photography, it's you should always be willing and always push yourself to try something different in photography. Also, it's a cheap full-frame Canon camera that fits well with EF glass. Now, with Canon moving more and probably completely now into mirrorless cameras, EF glass isn't really going to get made anymore, so EF glass might be a little more affordable than the RF glass. So this is a fantastic camera to pair with older EF lenses. And I couldn't recommend this lens anymore, but the Canon Nifty 50, the 50 f1.8, absolutely slaps on this camera. Only reason why I don't have it on there right now is because I broke mine from using it too much over the last few years, but I'm glad that I got a chance to use it on that camera before it completely just kicked the bucket. But if I didn't want to recommend this to anyone, it would be because Primarily, there is no video. And I know a lot of cameras nowadays, if not all cameras, have video functions. So if you're someone out there looking for a good photo and video camera, this ain't gonna be good for you. And the autofocus kind of sucks. I'll go right back to it. Autofocus is a little bit of a gamble from time to time. One of the other things, and this could be said for a lot of older digital vintage cameras, a lot of these older CCD cameras, is that nobody is really gonna fix it if it breaks. So if you invest a lot of time and energy into this camera and it goes down, it's gonna be a little hard to get it fixed. Now, it might be cheaper to replace it, but with the rising cost of some of these digital vintage cameras, now is not a bad time to, invest in a couple just in case. And finally, it might not be the right camera for you. So definitely do a little more research and definitely, maybe test it out. If your buddy or if your friend has an old 5D Classic, test it out. See if you can get your hands on one and see if this is something that you really like and something that you really want to invest in. But that's one of the benefits of it being so cheap right now, is you can try it out and it won't hurt your wallet too much. I've had this camera for 8 months and it consistently brings me joy every time I go out and use this camera. With the experience of using this camera and the images that it produces, it just goes to show you that your best camera is the one you have on you. At the start of this video, I mentioned before I bought this camera, I felt like my workflow and my work as a photographer was getting a little stale. So when I bought this camera, it was a different experience. It challenged me a little bit more and it was very refreshing. It made photography a lot more fun. I should also mention that if I hadn't bought the 5D Classic and invested a good bit of my time this year with this camera, then I never would have started shooting film this year. And if you know me, I low-key love shooting film. So thank you, the 5D Classic. Now, after this video is done, I absolutely continue to plan on using this camera, and I envision myself doing so as we head into 2024 and beyond. I plan on using this camera until I can't take pictures with it anymore, and I'll probably just keep on buying up old 5Ds until there are none left, because this is a fantastic camera and I absolutely love it. So that is why the Canon 5D Classic is my favorite and, in my opinion, the best camera that I bought in the year 2023. That is it for this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and please like and subscribe. I want to try and grow this channel here, and yeah, that's it. See ya.